Hi there. So I'll go ahead and tell you who I am. So my name is Kirsten Larson. I'm a children's book author. I'm based in Los Angeles County in California. I actually used to work in PR at NASA, which is where I sort of first came to love science and space, and then transitioned to children's book writing when my kids were really small and got really into nonfiction books at the library. And I started reading some of those nonfiction books and said, I think this is something that I could do, and it would be really fun to do because you get to kind of learn for a living. So I have a couple of books either already out or coming out. I have Woodwire Wings, which is the true story of Emma Lillian Todd, the first woman to design her own airplane, which flew in 1910. And in 2 weeks, I have A True Wonder, the comic book hero who changed everything. That's illustrated by Katie Wu. And that is kind of the story of how the comic book character Wonder Woman was created and her relationship to women's history throughout the 20th century. So I'm really excited about that one. But I will hand it over to Katherine so we can talk about this book, which is coming out next year.
Thanks. I'm Katherine Roy. I'm the illustrator of the picture book we'll be discussing today. And my background started with going to art school. I went to the Rhode Island School of Design for illustration and English, and then later went to the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont for cartooning and graphic novel writing and making words and pictures go together in a very visual way. And then I started working in picture books and had my first book as an author illustrator published in 2014, Neighborhood Sharks, which I went on location for to do the research. And then that was followed by a book about African elephants, how to be an elephant. And then I've done a couple more nonfiction books and illustrated some other fiction books since then. So this is my 7th or 8th project maybe, but my 5th main nonfiction book. And I'm just the illustrator in this case, but it's been a joy to research and work on too. So we're really excited to talk about it today. Yeah. So I guess we'll get started. We wanted to ask each other a few questions, sort of interview each other for you, and then take questions and answers at the end of the talk. And so I'm gonna start by asking Kirsten some questions, starting with our first question, which is, what drew you to Cecilia Payne and her story? What brought you to the decision to tell her story as 2 stories at once? And you have to explain that.
I will. So here's the magic. Will technology cooperate? I'm going to share my screen, and I will tell you that Katherine has the far better visuals for this talk. So you'll be delighted when you actually see what she has. So my knowledge of Cecilia Payne started in 2014. I'm a big fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson. And for those of you who have watched his reboot of the series, The Cosmos, that first season came out in 2014. And episode 8 was called Sisters of the Sun. And this was my first introduction to Annie Jump Cannon and Wilhelmina Fleming and Cecilia Payne. And it's basically about Harvard Observatory, the computers, and all the women working there, and some of the really groundbreaking work that they did. So this was, I think this episode came out in like April or May of 2014. I was actually at that time working on Woodwire Wings, which became my first picture book. So it was a few months later that I actually started really digging into this story and doing some research. So I think I started in like August 2014. So you can do the math on how long these books take by the time this one comes out. But one thing that really caught my eye was in introducing this segment, Neil deGrasse Tyson said, what she would discover at Harvard would challenge one of the central beliefs of astronomy. The resulting impact was basically the dawn of modern astrophysics. So for me as an author, I mean, here is a huge impact that this one person had. So immediately my mind goes to what makes a person like that tick? Who were they? What were they passionate about? And so as soon as I saw what he said about her, and in a later article, he also said, many people consider her thesis, Stellar Atmospheres, to be one of the most brilliant PhD theses in astronomy. So I was like, okay, this is somebody, and again, as a children's book author, I'm looking at what's out there, and nobody had written about her. Right? There was no children's biography of Cecilia Payne. There was one about Annie Jump Cannon. I think there's one about Henrietta Leavitt, but nothing about Cecilia Payne. So instantly I'm thinking, oh, this could be interesting. So for those of you, I know there are some people here who aren't coming from the Harvard side of things, but just to give you a little snapshot of what Cecilia Payne was doing, she lived at a time where we didn't know a lot about the stars. A lot of focus of astronomy had been on kind of stellar position, where stars were located. We were just started getting the tools to start to study the chemistry of stars. And they use something called a spectrograph. And it's essentially putting starlight through a prism. And you see something like what you see on your screen here, except at Harvard, these were black and white. And what you notice these lines cutting through the spectra. So a lot of people were starting to say, can we use this to study the chemistry of the stars? And they were able to do that. But at that time, a lot of people thought the sun and the earth were pretty much the same in composition. That if you could heat the earth to the temperature of the sun, you would get a spectrum that looked pretty much like what our sun looks like. They thought the sun had just as much metal as the earth does, just as much iron. But nobody had really figured out how to understand the proportions, how much of each element was in the sun. And Cecilia Payne did that. She studied these different spectra. She developed a series of eye estimates, and she was able to figure out that actually stars are mostly helium and hydrogen, which are the most abundant elements in the universe. And it was really this groundbreaking discovery. In fact, it was so groundbreaking. This is another screenshot from that Cosmos episode. But Henry Norris Russell, who was kind of the lead astronomer of the day at Princeton on this topic, looked at her thesis and said, no, there's no way. And he put a lot of pressure on her, and she ended up at the bottom of her thesis kind of retracting or hedging and saying, her discovery of how much helium and hydrogen are in the universe is improbably high and almost certainly not real. Well, a few years later, 4 years later, there was further research that backed up her findings, and everybody realized she was right all along. And so not only did she figure out that these were the most abundant elements in the universe, she also was able, Annie Jump Cannon had done work on developing like a star classification system based on the stellar spectra. And she assigned them different letters. Like O, K, it's O, be a fine girl, and kiss me, I think is the, the mnemonic device they use for the different star categories. But Cecilia Payne was able to figure out that temperature is what put stars in these different groups, how hot the stars were burning, which we now know also corresponds to where they are in their star life cycle. So she really did a lot of groundbreaking work for everything we know about how stars are born, how they live, how they die. And again, there was no children's book about her. So I'll talk about research in a second. But so I wrote what they call a cradle to grave type of book, right? It was very, it was one of my earlier books. So it was very straightforward, starting with her childhood in England and kind of going through her life, very straightforward writing. And then my friend Hannah Holt had a book announcement about a book she had. And actually, Katherine, she's from up by you. She's from the Portland area. But her book was called, I think it eventually came to be called Diamond and the Boy. But she pitched it as two books in one. And essentially the story of how diamonds are formed going one direction, and the story of the man who invented a way to create diamonds artificially kind of going the other direction, and the two stories met in the middle. So when I heard, this is before Hannah's book even came out, and it's actually different from what she had pitched. But when I heard that kind of got my brain turning. Like, is there a more interesting way to tell the story besides just starting with Cecilia's birth and, ending with her death? And so I wrote to my agent. This is so 3 years after I had started working on this project, and we were getting ready to sub it to editors. And I said, whoa, let's wait a second. And so I went back and I looked at my initial note to my agent and I said, so Cecilia is about what's inside versus outside, right? How she looks on the inside. She doesn't look like what people think of as a scientist, but in her heart, she is. So Cecilia is about what's inside versus outside in the makings of a star scientist who discovered what made the stars. Do you think it would be an additional selling point to include a few sidebars at specific points in the story showing how stars are made? The arc of their story sort of parallels Cecilia's. It adds another layer and rereadability. So I kind of had this idea of just supplementing Cecilia's story with the story of how stars are formed. Well, what ended up happening is something much more difficult. I think this is one of the more difficult projects for both Katherine and myself. What we ended up doing is telling a parallel story. So the story of how stars form takes place on the same page alongside Cecilia's formation as a scientist who studies the stars. And to make it even more difficult, every page has a linking line of text that applies to the star formation story and Cecilia's formation as a scientist. And you can read those lines of text across the whole book if you don't want to read the entire story. And hopefully, Katherine's going to show you some pictures of that. I'm going to read you the opening, but it's a little bit easier to understand when you see it laid out on the page. But this is from the very first page. It says, wrapped in a blanket of sparkling space, an unformed star waits for its bright future to begin. Cecilia kicks and cries until her mother sets her down so Cecilia can feel with her own tiny toes the cold and crackly snow, which isn't soft and warm like she expected. It's the first time Cecilia learns things aren't always as they seem. So she was an observer from the very beginning. But that's what I did throughout the book. So that very first line, wrapped in a blanket of sparkling space, an unformed star waits for its bright future to begin. So that line of text applies to both the star formation story and Cecilia's story as this kind of astrophysics superstar. And so I did that on every single page, which is quite a challenge to illustrate, but I know Katherine will talk about that in a minute. Okay, I think I'm ready for the next question.
Okay. Yeah, in other words, Kirsten tried to kill me.
I felt the same way though, because I did back off of that. I did back off of like the line connecting the two stories because I kind of wimped out and I was like, oh, this is too hard. And my agent was like, no, you really have to do it.
No, it's great. I'll talk about it though. Yeah. Question 2, what kind of outside research did you do?
Yeah. So research is kind of an ongoing process throughout the book. You do enough research to get enough information to write the book. But then there's so much fact checking throughout the whole process. Like I was looking stuff up a couple of months ago to verify things. I mean, it's just it's a whole process. But for me as an author, there are kind of two primary pieces that I need. So I need primary sources so that I can really, because picture book biographies are really about the person. I mean, yes, it's about what Cecilia Payne did as an astrophysicist, but for me, the really interesting part is who is she as a person? And so I have to know her thoughts and her feelings. I have to be able to hear her voice and get a sense of her personality. It's almost like acting. You kind of have to get into character and really feel this person deep in your bones before you can write their life story, especially in a picture book, because a picture book, you know, you have 32, maybe 40 pages to really distill the essence of this person's life. And so you really have to understand who they are and what makes them tick and get that across on the page. So for me, the primary sources are very important. And then there's a lot of secondary sources, like, you know, you guys are going to hear from David Sobel next week, The Glass Universe. I needed to understand how she fit into the context of astronomy. So there's a lot of secondary source research. So there's print research. And then I also so I have a physical file box with all my drafts and my hard copy sources and my books. And then I also have like a digital file box on my computer for every book I write. And this one had like almost 200 digital records. And these are journal articles, oral histories, her thesis, her other writings, her obituaries, journal and magazine articles. I interviewed a physicist who's written about her. I interviewed an astronomer to make sure I was getting the science of star formation right. And then, you know, you even have to do research into what are women's lives like at the turn of the 1900s, right? What's women's education like? What's the context for women's work? You have to kind of understand what women are experiencing at this time. So I did want to share just a couple of quick quotes, because I think one of the things that really made me fall in love with her was how much I see writing and science as similar creative processes. And one thing that she always remarked about was the feeling of discovering something. And that's kind of how I feel when I finally feel like I'm telling the story the right way. I finally got the right way to tell the story. And so I really resonated with a couple of her quotes. I'm just going to share them real quick. This is her when she's 8. She's in England. She says, the bee orchis, so this is a little orchid that looks like a bee, was growing in the long grass of the orchard. An insect turned to a blossom nestled in a purple star. Instantly, I knew it for what it was. My mother had told me of the Riviera, trapdoor spiders, and mimosa and orchids, and I was dazzled by a flash of recognition. For the first time, I knew the leaping of the heart, the sudden enlightenment that were to become my passion. I think my life as a scientist began at that moment. I must have been about 8 years old. And so she has several instances in her autobiography where she talks about sort of this feeling of what it feels like to have this sudden enlightenment, to be the first person in the world to understand something that nobody understands before. And so for me as a writer, you know, I struggle so much with what's the best way to tell this person's story. And I feel like I have so much understanding of that moment when it finally all comes together and you have a breakthrough. And so I think it was that insight into her mind that really made me fall in love with her.
Awesome. I love that quote too, with the bee and that whole scene in the book. It's just a wonderful example of her creativity and ingenuity. I mean, at 8, she figures out pollination and coevolution with bees and orchids. It's amazing. So yeah. The third question that we wanted to ask you is, I mean, it's clear to me that you love writing stories about women, nonfiction stories about and biographies about women and their accomplishments. What draws you to these stories, and why do you think they're important for kids?
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts about this. So I think what really draws me in a lot of cases is sort of unlikely heroes and redefining what heroism is or what a scientist looks like
Mm-hmm.
or who a leader is. I think in in most of history, we've defined a lot of these things as very male. And so for me, it often means going back and putting women back in the narrative of history because they've always been there. We've just forgotten to tell their story. Like Cecilia Payne, like Emma Lillian Todd and her airplane. Um, but the women have been there. So for me, I think it's a lot about sort of underdogs and redefining what we think of when we say words like hero or scientist. And I will say, so one more thing before I jump over and ask Katherine some similar questions. Because this book doesn't come out until next year, I think Katherine and I both have newsletter lists and we have websites. So if you want to kind of track the progress of the book and find out when it's actually coming out, you can sign up, go to our websites or sign up for my newsletter. I put the information there. So
Cool. Thank you. You're on it. I did not put such a link in my presentation, but I will say it at the end.
But if you Google Katherine, I'm sure you can find it.
Yeah. Cool. Something I'm noticing too about these covers and mine too is that you have and I know you didn't draw them, but what's interesting is that all of them feature women looking up with adventure and discovery in their eyes, and that's just a really cool legacy that you're building as an author to be writing these books. So thank you for that contribution. I'm excited for the girls that are going to read these books to have these as examples, because they certainly didn't exist when we were younger. So
exactly. And for boys, I think I'm a mom of boys, and I definitely want them to know that women have been aeronautical engineers since the early 1900s and astrophysicists since the 1920s.
Yeah. So you have two sons?
Yeah, I have two boys.
Okay, and I have two boys too. They're much younger, but cool. I feel the same way too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right. So now you're going to see them more visually. Oh, I'm going to stop screen share. And I know Katherine has some cool stuff to show.
Okay, so I'll jump over to my screen share. Yeah, well, I'll do that in a second. I'll let you go ahead and ask your first questions.
Yeah. So I think, the part of the reason we're here today is because, so real quick, we don't, as authors, once I sell the book, I don't get to pick who illustrates it. That is the job of the publisher. And the publisher normally has a vision for the style of illustration. And our publisher, Chronicle Books, hired Katherine. And so I think I did have some input. I was like, oh yeah, Katherine's awesome. But you never know, right? Some people nonfiction illustration is its own thing, right? And some people get really into the research and some people are not as into the research, but you'll find out which type Katherine is. What kind of outside research did you do for this book?
Well, I happen to really love research. They picked well, if that's what you were looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and share how I go about doing things, because I'm kind of a nut when it comes to research. Can you all see that there with the shark? Okay, great. So my first nonfiction book that I got to work on was a book that I wrote and illustrated, and it was a book about great white sharks. And I was reading lots of scientific papers about sharks and trying to turn it into a story that kids could access. I feel like that's my job, translating science into words and pictures. And so with my shark book, let's see, I got to actually go to the Farallon Islands. I contacted the scientists. I went out on the boat with them. I watched them tagging great white sharks in the water. It was amazing. And then after that book came out, I got to go and do an elephant research trip to do my second book about elephants. And so I actually went to Africa, and I got to see the same thing, scientists tagging and tagging elephants. Of course, they don't use a little dart tag. They actually put a collar around an elephant's neck. And this elephant, you can see, has a little dart in its butt. It's about to go to sleep because they're going to put a collar around his neck. So I got to do this on location research. So I love taking in information, and I love having this amazing experience and then pouring it myself and all of that information into the book. The trouble is with this book and with Otis and Will Discover the Deep, which I did after my elephant book, is that you can't go back in time. So I can't go visit Cecilia Payne. I can't go meet Otis and Will and see their bathysphere and explore it. But luckily, in both of these cases, there's extensive archives of their work and pictures of them at their activities and all this information about their research. And so that's the avenue I took to try to get to know Cecilia Payne and pour as much as I could from what I was finding into the work itself. And then, of course, Kirsten set me up with not just one task of learning more about Cecilia Payne, but also learning about astrophysicists and astrophysics and how stars are made, which I knew nothing about. I remember my agent sent me an email telling me that there was this manuscript that Chronicle wanted me to consider. And I wrote back saying, I got a C in physics. Is it okay that I got a C in physics? Because I only got a C in physics because I did the visual aids in class. I kind of hated physics. Is this like, is it okay? He's like, it's okay, you can do it. I was like, all right. So I had a lot to learn, and I'm still not sure that I understand very much of it, but I got through it, and I did a lot of research. And my dad used to work for Hewlett Packard, and he loves stars, and he loves following NASA. And I had done a book about Mars as well, and so I had enough context and some resources there to just get someone to explain things to me. So I would call my dad when I was really stuck and say, explain how they know from this bar chart with some notes on it, like that this is helium from the sun, and he would explain and he'd help me. So there's a lot to learn here. Just like Kirsten, I went to read her autobiography, and I read the book, The Glass Universe, and tried to get to know the computers and Harvard and the women. I had also lived in Cambridge near Harvard Square in my late 20s and knew the area very well. So it's helpful to already have that interest and connection in Cambridge and the research and history of the time. So I was learning about Cecilia Payne, learning about stars forming and thinking about how to draw that. And I didn't know how I was going to do it. And then, of course, the Wolbach Library and Lindsay Smith and Maria McKieran, I think is how you say her name, were extraordinarily helpful. My mom actually took a trip to Boston around the time that I got picked to do this manuscript, and she took a bunch of reference photos for me. But Lindsay and Maria were just incredibly gracious in letting me, helping me to understand certain questions that I had, sending me archival material to look at, just digital records of things, so that I could get to know Cecilia Payne, get to know the computers, and get to know the area of Harvard and what it looked like at the time, because I needed to represent all of these things in the work. Just like she was saying about how you feel like you need to embody the character or act the character, I really felt like I needed to know where she worked, what it looked like, what the desks look like, what the books look like, how she moved and stand and get to know all these things about her. And not just as an adult, but as a kid too. And so I'm trying to figure out what Cecilia Payne would look like as a little girl at 3, and then at 14, and then, as a young adult at 20, was really challenging because I had to also make this character age appropriately according to each page turn and what Kirsten had written. So it was a big challenge from the start to do all of this research because there were just so many moving pieces in the book. So that was Cecilia Payne when she was little. Here's her when she's in her early 20s and then 30s. I particularly love the pictures on the right-hand corner. There's this one where she's wearing a hat. And clearly this one is a few minutes later where someone told her to take off her hat. And she's like, I took off my hat, is how I learn it, or how I read it when I look at it. So she's got a lot of fire and spark in her personality. And even though I can't meet her, it's easy to tell from the photos just kind of how she moved and stood and interacted with people. Very sort of stern, but also with a sense of humor and playful. There's some photos, this is one of them, from a play that she was in, and I can't tell what's happening in the play, but it looks very theatrical and dramatic. And having photo reference of her doing different things other than just sitting at her desk was really helpful, because I need to draw and move her through space in this book and in my art. And then, of course, getting to know the different women that she was working with, especially Annie Jump Cannon, and all these different women in this very clearly staged photo, but very helpful because I can see what kind of chairs they sat at and what their desks look like, and that there was a big globe in the room. So I know what to put in the room when I draw them at work in the book. And then, of course, this picture here of the room was really helpful because I actually use it later in the actual book. Let's see, I also needed to know what the the observatory looked like, because I needed to have it in the book as well. So I studied a lot of maps from the Wolbach Library and just old drawings of it and photographs of it. Looking at the brick building that she used to work in. She worked on one of the upper floors on, I believe, the new addition. So this is the old brick building, and then this is the new brick building with the addition here on the campus. And here it is over here in this picture, because I needed to be able to see where she worked and put her up on top of the building for a scene later in the book. And so to do that effectively, I actually built my version of the astronomy lab in Google SketchUp. So this is some turnarounds of it. It didn't take too long to do, because I often use Google SketchUp to figure things out. But so this was so that I could light it and turn it and figure out the exact scene that I wanted and the exact angle, so that I wouldn't have to try to draw all these things in perspective without any help, because I'm not actually very good at perspective. So this is the brick building positioned about where I think it would go according to the map, next to the observatory, before all the new construction was done to bring it to a sort of different layout that it is today. And this is the angle that I picked for a scene at the end of the book. Let's see here. So this is her in a workroom. These are some sketches. We've got the observatory over here, and then them in the brick building. And we've got Annie Jump Cannon using her little fly swatter to look at stars. Here's some reference that I used of London to think about a scene where we've got lots of London streets. My computer is just filled with so many pictures of Victorian clothing and Edwardian clothing and London streets and kids playing. And I Google lots of weird things and make folders of them so that I have reference of kids jumping and leaning on things, and so that I can think about how these characters might move in space and what these different buildings and vehicles look like at the time. This interesting cross-section between, having horse-drawn carts and the technology of the car coming in about 1910, when I think this scene takes place, which results in this sketch here, when we've got the different cars and people moving around, and then her family here as they're moving to London from the country. I also really was helped by the Silent Sky production stills, which is a play that I think went on a few years ago, but the cast actually took photos in the Harvard refractory area. And so I was able to use some of these sketches to see the size of the women and how they would fit in that space. So I could draw Cecilia herself, who's over here sitting at the refractory. And here's some sketches from that. I'd also pose myself to help with some of the research, because I needed to see how light would fall over my shoulder or the expression. So this is me trying to figure out a scene where she's opening her certificate in the mail for the first time. Our editor had wanted the scene of Cecilia in her graduation robes among a sea of men. But then we discovered that not only did she not have graduation robes and she didn't attend a graduation, she only would have received a certificate in the mail because she technically didn't have a degree and didn't graduate because she was a woman. So I contacted the Newnham College archive librarian, and she sent me a scan of a very similar certificate that they had on file, so I could see exactly what it looked like. And then I sort of made a fake one and went outside when the light was low and took videos of myself with this over my shoulder, and then kind of did some searching for people opening letters with Harry Potter and Pride and Prejudice and stuff, so I could figure out like what would be a good way to make this look. And then came up with this scene here with her sister next to her and her opening the certificate, showing that she's finally got this title degree and will about to go to Harvard to work with the computers there. Here's me on the ground, thinking late at night. I've got some books spread out with me. I've photoshopped myself into a fake perspective room from Google SketchUp so that I can see what the desk would look like and where the chairs would go, which helped me do this sketch here, thinking about how to show her breakthrough without using a lot of overlays or math equations or something, trying to show that she's working and thinking late at night before she has this discovery. And then here's one more, me at my desk holding tea for this sketch of her having just completed her thesis, and the sun is coming through the window, and the two stories come together. And so finally she's had this discovery and trying to tie these two storylines into one image, and then moving forward with just one image instead of two split images, going forward with the story. Yeah, okay. I think that's the end of some of the research of how I went about the book, just doing lots of reading, lots of Googling, and lots of playing around with art, and posing myself as Cecilia to try to compile some of the drawings.
So if you did not have an appreciation for nonfiction illustration, now you do. Now you know how much work it is. This is no, and I mean, I'm always amazed. And I mean, there was even like an illustration fact checker who went through all of the illustrations to make sure.
Me too.
I mean, the level of detail and accuracy is just, it's absolutely blows me away every single time. So my big question is, because we're doing these two stories at the same time, how did you figure out the best way to illustrate that, to kind of have like a through line or a way of consistently showing what we were trying to do?
So this is the trickiest layout book design project that I've ever tried to do. And that includes everything that I worked on as, a cartoonist in graduate school. I mean, the book that I'm writing and illustrating right now is very tricky because the structure is hard to figure out for the story arc and how much information to put in. It's about reproductive biology, and I'm writing and illustrating it. It's a very difficult project because of all the fact checking. It feels like every spread is a new chapter to fact check and figure out. But the layouts aren't that hard. I know where things go. This book, to try to tell two stories at once, was really, really tricky. And one of the things that started us out was that, I'll keep it here for a second. One of the things that started me out on the project was our editor telling me to think about it like a split screen. And so I sort of thought we would have a tall book, and she did too. And the top would be the star story, and the bottom would be Cecilia's story told at the same time. And so I just went with that to start thinking about laying out the book from the very beginning. What I make when I first start making a book is a book map. This is a book map for a different book, but basically, you number all your little squares according to the number of spreads in the book. You figure out where the title page goes, you write down the end papers, and then you say, okay, this text goes on this page, this text goes on this page, and then you start making your little thumbnails, and then you start drawing, and you make sketches, you put it into the computer, you put the text in, you figure out where things go, and you just start working on it. That's what usually happens. And so I started that way too. I made little thumbnails. Here's Cecilia thinking on the title page. Here's her mom, and she's touching the snow for the first time. She's having an epiphany about the bee. She's feeling this black hole behind her. And I thought, well, maybe I'll put, the story up top, but it'll kind of creep down into the page, or maybe I'll have her like overlay the background somehow. I was still trying to think what split screen might mean. And making little thumbnails like I do, and then putting it into the computer with the text. So I had this split screen at the top with this blanket of space, and then here's Cecilia and her mom getting out of the little pram that she's in and touching the snow for the first time. These are very early sketches. Here's her thinking about this bee. This is not very clear, but there's like a bee here, and she's looking at an orchid, and she's sort of hunched down, and there's an explosion over here behind her. I just grabbed a photo off the internet of an explosion to just sort of mock up what I wanted. And then she's thinking, and then, they're going to move to London, and she's terrified. And then here's her at school, and she's having this discovery, and we still got this split screen going on at the top. So I did the first pass of the book like this, and our editor said, no, this doesn't feel quite right. Try something else. And I didn't know what else to do. I mean, I agreed that there wasn't enough space at the top for the story, but I didn't know how to proceed. It felt like I was just really stuck trying to tie these two things together on one spread without having any other room to work. It's like everything has to fit here. How is it going to fit together? So after thrashing around about it for a while, putting it aside for a couple months, coming back, putting it aside, coming back, I was like, okay, well, let's just use the gutter. I had learned that Kirsten had this book about the diamond and the boy that she had used as a mentor text, it's called. And so I went to the library and I got it, and I was like, oh, okay, the diamond story is on one side and the persons on the other side, like I'll just use the gutter, the fold in the book, to be the split between the two things. I was like, great, okay, we'll just do that. So the sun's on one side, Cecilia's on the other, awesome. So it looked like this for a while, with my sketches just dragged from the other document and put into here and laying it out again. London, and then like that sort of smoky feeling in London kind of creeping over into the stars. And then here's her discovery, something glimmers and glows, and she's like in this secret place in the lab in her school. And I thought this was working and this is what we're going to do. And I was really excited and I turned it in and they're like, not quite working. We're not sure if we like this. I was like, what else is there? There's nothing else to do. I have no idea what to do. And so finally our editor said, okay, well, here's my idea. And she sent me this exactly in an email. She sent me these sketches of these little thumbnails of here's supposed to be the star story here. And then the panel changes size to here. And then the panel changes size to here. And then it goes away here. And then it's behind. And then it's behind. And then over here, she had it start to change shape. So you can see it's like a shape changing here. And what she was doing is she was having the star story in front sometimes. And then sometimes it was behind. And I saw when she had the shape changing here and here and here, and it wasn't square anymore. I saw this, and apologies to Melissa if she's listening or watching this later. I was like, this does not work at all. This is not going to happen. But if we keep it either in front or in back, I think it can work. And so I decided to pull Cecilia's stories forward and keep her in square panels and then have the star story go in the back. And that finally made it start to work. There's a Neil Gaiman quote that goes something like, my editors are 99% right when pointing out the problem, but 99% wrong when telling me how to solve it. And that was sort of the experience that I had with this. Like I needed her to tell me what she thought would work. And that gave me the idea for how to fix it, but this wasn't quite the right solution. And so what happened next was me using the kind of background behind the story and making it a wider book. So I had more space on one side to tell the star story, and then have the parallel of Cecilia next to me. So you can see in this how much I'm using stock photos, how much I'm using Google SketchUp. I think I've grabbed this from some photo of a Victorian outfit. And then this is, this blanket is from a photo that I took of my son with a blanket on him. And I just throw it all together because this is not the final art. I'm just using it as a composition to figure out how I'm going to lay this out. Same thing here. So this is going to be a panel behind this other piece of art here with Cecilia in her garden about to have this discovery with the flower. Here's this behind Cecilia as she's in the attic. And so I showed these new layouts to the team and they liked them and said that it was working, which is a relief because I had no other cards in my hand. This was the last thing that I had to play, or else I just felt like I was going to have to quit and somebody else was going to have to do it because clearly I don't know what I'm doing. And so that's how I moved forward with that. Now, when I thought I was all done, I was like, okay, great. I'm just going to execute the art. Awesome. And I pulled out my watercolors and I started painting. And I realized that everything that I painted was not alive. It just felt flat and dead and it was not working at all. This is a painting that I did of a star forming. And I just felt like the watercolor wasn't doing what I wanted and it didn't have any luminosity. And then I started painting Cecilia and Miss Dalgish in this scene. And I thought, oh, like the watercolor doesn't work at all. Like it feels so flat and, you know, not alive. And how are these two things going to connect? Oh no, I don't know what I'm doing again. And so I was just really frustrated again with how to make these two stories tie together. They not only need to lay out correctly so that you can read it as two stories or one story at once, but the art needed to feel connected, except one is about these explosions of gas that make stars, and the other is about a little girl in her garden and then growing up to be a scientist. Like, how do you make marks? How do you make art that makes those two things work together? And I was completely stumped. So I just started drawing like shapes and explosions with ink on a page. And I decided I'm not going to even use color. I'm just going to use walnut ink and just like use toothbrushes and rough brushes and just like make marks, because this is how it feels to make a star. And I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to make some of this and see what happens. So I started drawing like this and drawing like this and making planets with salt and just very neutral tone watercolor. And then I started drawing, different characters in the book. So here's 3 versions of Annie Jump Cannon. And I think I liked the body and the head on this one, but maybe like the nose on this one. I could go into Photoshop and take one thing and put it over here and combine them. And so because I was letting go of trying to make a painting, like make an original, then I could pick and choose which expressive drawings felt most alive and then put them together in Photoshop. So here's a drawing that I really liked with Cecilia Payne, and here's her teacher, and I really like this one, so I picked this one, and I start putting things together. So now instead of this sort of flat watercolor piece, I can pull together these different marks and make a protostar starting to form and spin and explode that can look like this if I light it and change the colors and stuff in Photoshop. And then I can use a mark like this and turn it into something like this to make it feel really alive and dynamic and let the watercolor do some of the talking instead of me trying to render a star explosion. And so some marks like this, where I'm trying to draw this spiraling star formation, can turn into something like this. So it felt organic and direct, and I could actually make the 2 things start to talk together so that they had a language in common and didn't feel so flat. So that was where I started to go with the art, not knowing if anybody would like it or think it was okay, because this isn't what I usually do. But I really thought that it could work, and I was really delighted when our editor was on board too. So it was really exciting to work on this because it was like a new direction for me and also closer to my handwriting than maybe my past books. And then the last thing that I had to figure out was color scheme. So I was looking at a lot of Wes Anderson films and these sort of red, brown, green colors, and trying to think about her universe in this color palette, knowing that it's a historical book and a biography, but also about star formation and the different colors that we attribute to stars, and doing some color sketches. This is called a color script, where you try to figure out what the colors in a book are going to be, and then applying that so that I could have a really lush landscape that felt really vibrant, but still worked with that sort of sepia tone that I had in the background. So here's the observatory. Here's one of the pictures of a star forming. And then here's Cecilia in the refractory, at the refractory telescope, looking up at the stars that happens towards the end of the book. And so what we're at right now is finally in a very exciting stage where the production designer starts to put the text on the book and picks the font, and we work to make sure that everything's really readable, and I take stars out from behind where the words are going to go, and we actually do final layouts so that we can move the book towards production and it can get printed and come out next year. So this is the only page in the book that does have a true split, with the star story fully happening on one side and Cecilia's story happening on the other side. And you can see the notes from the editor and the designer of things that they want me to change. And so the next step for me is to go through and make those tiny tweaks, which I'm very happy to do, because compared to all the other work that's been done, this is the really easy part. So, so that's a little bit about how the 2 stories came together in the art. It's taken, I guess, 2 years or so that I've really been working on it off and on to get it to the point where I'm happy with it, the production team's happy with it, and it can actually move forward, because it was just such a tricky thing to work on. So,
the interesting thing is,
yeah.
I never saw, like, I didn't see any of this. Like,
Yeah.
this is the I think I saw a very early dummy. I never saw the side-by-side split screen. I never saw Melissa's notes to you. So this is awesome, because this is the first time that Katherine and I really get to hear about how Katherine approached it. But again, that feeling of kind of, I don't know what I'm doing. That's what I go through too, right? And that's exactly what I went through right before I figured out I'm going to tell this parallel story and we're going to have this line of text. I was at that same point, and that's exactly the point that Cecilia Payne was at right before her big breakthrough, right? So I think it's so interesting how creative scientists are, and how much trial and error and engineering and trying things there is in art. It's just it's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So I had one more question for you, which is, I know you love to tell stories about science and the natural world, and I'm just curious why you feel drawn to those sorts of stories.
It just feeds me. It makes me feel alive. I always loved taking nature classes as a kid and drawing nature and knowing the names of plants and animals. I love biology. And what's been interesting about this project is getting to access this different part of science that I don't usually engage with as much, the physical sciences and geology and star formation. It's been a really interesting learning experience for me. And I guess I feel like if I work on these books and I'm excited about them, that can help kids get excited about it too. And I think curious kids are kids that are interested in asking questions, that are interested in different solutions that have been presented. They're investigating their own projects, and these kinds of books help feed that curiosity. So I love them because I love them, but I also love them because kids get excited about it too. So it's worthwhile to share. So yeah.
So Nico, did we have any questions?
So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and you can unmute yourself or use the raise hand feature and just go ahead.
I do see a question here in the chat that says, from Julia, that says, Katherine, how much input did a book designer have in the concept for the layouts? Kirsten and Katherine, this book looks wonderful.
Thank you. I checked in at each point where I had a mock-up, and then the designer would make some comments and I would agree or disagree. We would discuss it, and then I would go to the next round. So it's tricky when you're me and you have a vision for what you want it to look like and you have to compromise with the team. It can be difficult sometimes to figure out what's best for the book. But I have also learned from experience that the team is right as a group, that everybody putting their heads together is going to make it look the best as possible. So it is hard at first with every project that I do, even if I've written and illustrated it or not. I've got this idea, it's been in my head for 6 months or a year or 5 years, and it's looked a certain way because I've laid it out in the computer and I imprint on it like a little duckling. And then the production editor says, oh, let's change the font, let's move this over here. I'm like, no, wait, that's not what I did. I don't know if I like that. And then if I sit with it for a while, it's like, oh, okay, that's good, she's right. So this book would not have come to the panel layout and the split story that it has without that production input, and I think it's much stronger for it. So it's just a learning experience to work with each new team and figure out how you're going to make the best book possible, and then let their input and work together with yours to make the project look good. So.
And we also go through that on the tech side too, right?
Yes,
I mean,
I bet.
we go through draft after draft after draft, and then you write it again with your agent, and then you send it to the editor and they buy it, and then they have comments, and it may be nothing like what they actually bought. I mean, so it's on both sides too.
And I bet sometimes that you've got a sentence that you love and they want to cut it, right?
Oh,
or
yeah.
a word. Yeah. And so it's hard because you're killing off a little bit of it so that it can be better. And that process is really painful sometimes. So I guess it's always painful, but you get used to it, I think is what happens.
Well, because like you said, we always, at the end of the day, we always have to come back to what's the story we're trying to tell, and what's the best way to tell that story. Yeah. And all these people we work with have so much experience. I mean, making books is a team sport. And so when everybody weighs in, you really get the best story. Yeah.
There should be so many more names on the book, or at least inside the book, of people that never get credit from the public that are part of it. Yeah. Any other questions? Got a few more minutes.
Yeah, we have one more question in the chat here from Emily. She says, thank you for inviting us to take a sneak peek of your project, Kirsten and Katherine. I appreciate your comments about women's history stories being for all people. Could you say a little bit more about how this intention shapes your project in terms of storytelling or marketing?
You should go first.
I think for me, it really starts with what stories appeal to me. because there are so many more stories in this world that I could write. And so it really becomes a question of what's the story for me to tell? You know, what's the right, I have limited time. And so for me, you know, the interesting thing is children's books are really at the leading edge, I think, of bringing not just women's history to light, you know, forgotten women's history, but also all kinds of diverse figures in terms of ethnicity and culture and sexual orientation. And so, you know, for me, it's just always, my interest is always piqued when I think somebody is turning convention on its head. That to me gets my antenna up. And I think, you know, it's sort of what people expect of you, and then you give them something different. And I don't know, maybe that says something about my psyche. I mean, maybe I feel like, I mean, I came to writing for children very late. I mean, I was in my, mid 30s. You know, I started doing this as like a second career. So I think in some ways, this idea of turning convention on its head, or, you know, thinking of yourself as like an underdog, I think maybe that taps into that, and taps into why I like to tell women's stories and stories of people who defy expectations.
I think for me, there's gaps that really need to be filled in children's books. And I think the market is doing a good job of demanding that. And I think publishers are stepping up to offer it. And women's history, diversity books, those are huge gaps. There have been so many books about animals, and so many books about, you know, history that features white men and male figures. And so it's really nice to have the opportunity to do a book about a female scientist who discovered something amazing and nobody knows much about her. I know Present Company knows a lot about her, but broadly speaking, if you talk to somebody in the grocery store, people do not know who Cecilia Payne is. So it's exciting to have the opportunity to bring new content to kids and to children's books. And kids eat all of it up. They love it. I mean, they have no bias about any of this. They're just excited to learn something new and cool if you write it and draw it in a way that engages them. So it's just a cool opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're at the top of the hour. So if anyone needs to head out, we totally understand. We do have, you know, one more question in the chat. It looks like if you both have the time. Let's see. Farida says, I have an MG nonfiction MS, I'm assuming like manuscript, about our son. I have used a graphic/comic book format as I felt that the concepts would be easier to understand. Is it a good idea to write a nonfiction graphic book? Kirsten and Katherine, thank you for writing and illustrating a wonderful book.
I mean, sure, it's a good idea. Anything's a good idea. It's the execution of the idea that matters. I think that the world would be a better place if everybody wrote and everybody drew, even if they didn't have any specific intention to become a multimillionaire as an author and illustrator. Can I speak to whether or not your book will sell 50,000 copies? I can't, but I would encourage you, if you want to be an author, to go for it. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, and that's kind of my, you know, I kind of think no experimentation is ever wasted, right? So even if a project never sells, you learn something by going through that process. So I love to try new things, new structures, new voices, and you just never know. I mean, I actually have a book coming out in a few years. It started out as a biography of Edwin Hubble and morphed into this love letter to science that has absolutely nothing to do with Edwin Hubble. So you just never know where things will take you. And so I'm always a big fan of experimenting and trying new things and seeing where it goes.
Yep. Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming out today and for listening to us talk. This is the first time that we've ever gotten to present together, and it's the first time that we've ever met in a Zoom call face to face in any capacity. So it's been really fun for us and a great treat. And we're really delighted to be talking to especially this group of people, because this is the ground zero for where Cecilia Payne, you know, became a rock star scientist.